Hi, this episode of the Comics Alternative, one of the most insightful and intelligent comic podcasts out there, is brought to you in part with the support of Patreon pledges from listeners like me, Sal Good Sam. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that helps content providers generate some income for content they often give away for free, like this show. As a comic artist, I use it myself. It's been a huge help in making ends meet, and I'm super pleased to be able to pass some of that on via my own pledges to a number of other creators like Derek and Andy, so they too can enrich our cultural landscape. Become a patron of the arts and letters. Pledge today at patreon.com/comicsalternative.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 171. Reviews of The Eternaut, Nowhere Men, number 7, and Amazing Forest, number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right, we are. And on this week's episode, Andy and I are going to be discussing 3 recent titles. We're going to start with Hector Germain Osterheld and Francisco Solano Lopez's The Eternaut. After that, issue number 7 of Nowhere Men by Eric Stevenson and Dave Taylor. And then we're going to wrap up with Amazing Forest number 1, written by Eric Freitas and Ulysses Farinas, and a host of artists. But before we get into those lively discussions, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off of the cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts are higher than that.
And, you know, if you've never taken advantage of the bundles that they have at DCB Service, you really should take a look, because what they'll do is they bundle a lot of individual issues together and they offer them at a discount, a much greater discount than you would have in buying them individually. 2 of those bundles that we have for January, we have the Vertigo new series bundle, and that's 13 new Vertigo titles for 50% off. And there's also a Valiant bundle, the 7 newest Valiant titles for 50% off. There's tons of other bundles there. You just need to go to the website and check them out.
That's right. That's Discount Comic Book Service, their website, dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Exactly.
And you know, Andy, you can get a lot of books from Discount Comic Book Service, and you're going to need to stay awake in order to read them all. And one of the best ways of doing so is by going to the website of our other sponsor, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. And everything is roasted to order. They do it in small batches with no mass production.
That's right. And you know, Just Coffee Co-op partners with On the Ground to raise money and awareness for sustainable community development in farming regions all over the world. And Derek, the most exciting thing about this is there's no minimum order and the shipping is free. I mean, absolutely free shipping.
Wow.
Yeah. So what you need to do is go to their website, Just Coffee, one word, justcoffee.coop, C-O-O-P. And at checkout, use our coupon code COMICS. That's all caps, C-O-M-I-C-S. Now, when you do that, this is going to give you 10% off your order, and it will help support our podcast here at the Comics Alternative. So please go to their website and get caffeinated. That's justcoffee.coop. And you know, Derek, even, if our listeners maybe they're not coffee fans, they also have chocolate there.
Wow, chocolate, and they also have tea. So whether it's coffee, tea, or chocolate, so you can't go wrong with just Coffee Co-op. So, Andy, this is, I think this is the first regular show you and I have done in the new year. Is that correct?
It is. Gwen and I just recorded a Young Readers episode yesterday. So this is the first regular episode I've done in 2016.
Well, how's your new year been so far?
Oh, boy, it has been really, really busy. But it's been very good. Reading a lot of stuff, reading a lot of comics related stuff and some other things, some prose works as well. Just all over the place. I'm just reading like a madman.
Yeah, that's good. And, you're reading comics, which is, good for what we do at the Comics Alternative.
Yep.
Yeah. One of the things that I read last year, in fact, is the first book that we're going to be discussing today. So you want to go ahead and get into the reviews for this week?
Yeah, let's do.
Now, Hector Osterheld and Francisco Lopez's The Eternaut came out in November of last year. And in fact, that's the date that I see on Amazon.com. But Andy, when you and I were at SPX, I remember seeing copies of The Eternaut over at the big Fantagraphics table. So you could have gotten it back in September, I guess.
You could have, and I almost picked it up there, but I went home and pre-ordered it, and actually during the convention, so I didn't pick it up. And maybe I should have, although I do have a copy now. But they went really fast at SPX. And Derek, also, I was looking this morning, both Fantagraphics and Amazon are sold out of the Eternaut. More copies are coming. So if you listen to our podcast and want to get a copy of the Eternaut, they're on the way. But I don't think you can get one right now unless you bought it from a third party.
Actually, you can go to Discount Comic Book Service, our sponsor, and you can find it at 35% off.
Oh, really?
Which is actually cheaper than you can get it at Amazon. And we'll remind you guys at the end of the show to go to dcbservice.com and get your copy of Eternaut, because both Andy and I wholeheartedly recommend it. Now, we were talking about that this came out mid-fall or late fall of last year. But this is something that was a major publication, and we've been wanting to talk about it. It's just toward the end of 2015, we didn't have time to do so. But for one of our first shows of 2016, we wanted to be sure to bring it into a conversation.
Yeah, well, Derek, I'm so glad that DCB Service has that because it seems like I looked right after Christmas and I didn't see it there, so maybe they got more in. That's definitely good news. And yeah, I'm very excited to talk about this. I know this was on your list of the top books of 2015. It was also on my list as well. So yeah, I'm very excited to talk about this great book.
Yeah. Now we should tell readers a little, I guess, backstory of the Eternaut. The actual title, the original Spanish title, was El Eternata. It was published in Argentina. And it was originally serialized between 1957 and 1959 in Hora Cero Semanal. And I am not a Spanish speaker. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. But that's the original serialization. But it was revisited by Osterheld a couple of other times. It was remade in 1969, and then there was another part created in 1976. So this has a long history, and this is just last year when it was released, was the first time that the Eternaut was published in English, which I find surprising because this is a very famous comic. And it's something that has been translated in a variety of different languages, but until last year, never in English. And one of the things that made this so famous is that it had quite a cultural and political impact. Many believe that Osterheld was writing and then rewriting this story in light of political developments going on in Argentina in the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s. So you can read some of the things as allegorical. So, it has had quite an impact, but it's taken a long time to get to English-speaking audiences.
It has. And Derek, one of the other interesting things about the not just the book itself, but Osterheld's life and his other works, because he also did this comic that was based on Che Guevara, and that was actually banned by the Argentinian government. And Osterheld's politics got him in a lot of trouble, especially with that book. And all that we know about the end of Osterfeld's life is he and his family were taken, apparently by the government, either in 1976 or 1977, and never heard from again. So it's very, very mysterious. Of course, he was not the only person that happened to in that time. A lot of political shenanigans going on there, very, very serious shenanigans going on. So there's so much mystery around what exactly happened to him and his family. But this book, as you have said, has become like a cultural phenomenon there. I don't know if we really have anything in America that we can compare it to, because apparently you can walk down the streets of Buenos Aires and you can see this image of the Eternaut everywhere. Mm-hmm. So it apparently has, obviously very, very strong connotations to the people in Argentina. And you're right, Derek. I wonder, too, why it's taken so long for this book to become translated into English here.
Yeah, that'd be curious to discover the reason. I mean, I'm curious to discover the reasons why it's taken so long to be translated into English. Now, you mentioned the famous image of the Eternaut. If our listeners aren't aware of this, just go to any kind of search, whether it be Google or Bing, and put in Eternaut or El Eternata, and you will see this image. It's of a man who is in a suit of some sort, and he's wearing a mask and a device over his mouth in order to breathe, and he has a gun with him. And this is quite a famous image, so you may have seen it, but you didn't know what this referred to. And this has been used not only in reference to the comic, obviously, but also along with other political movements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, it's definitely, it has a fascinating backstory. And, you mentioned that Osterheld and his family were taken by the Argentinian government and were, as they called it, disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared. And, you say a lot of people, this happened a lot during the 1970s and 80s during what's called the Dirty War in Argentina, where you had a lot of government oppression, taking individuals who spoke out against usually right-wing efforts of the government, and they weren't heard from again. And unfortunately, that is what apparently happened to Hector Osterheld.
Mm. Yeah.
Now, the story, if you read it as an allegory, it definitely has quite a political punch to it. But you don't have to read it allegorically. It is a great science fiction, I guess you can call it a post-apocalyptic narrative.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about the story is, you don't, like you said, you don't have to read it as an allegory. You can, but you can just take it as a straight science fiction story, which is a fantastic story. You don't have to read it as a political statement. And the great thing about it is the book's politics do not overwhelm the story to the point of it serving as a polemic.
Mm-mm. Now there are references to the Cold War in this story. Mm-hmm. Every now and again they pop up, that, the American government is going to be doing such and such, or that they see missiles and they assume that those are coming from the United States. But it's definitely not heavy-handed. But what really drives the Eternaut is this alien invasion narrative.
Mm-hmm.
which is what the Eternaut is really all about when it comes to just the bare bones story. So, okay, so how should we encapsulate what goes on in the Eternaut?
Well, it's really a large frame story, if we want to call it that, and it opens with a man named Juan Salvo, who is a time traveler, and he mysteriously appears, as fate would have it, to an Argentinian cartoonist, which is kind of neat. And Salvo tells this Argentinian cartoonist the tale of how he became to be the Eternaut. And he talks about the alien invasion that started, that he witnessed, and how it went from there. So really most of the book is backstory about how the alien invasion happened, where he was, how it affected his friends and family. That is the thrust of the book. And when we get back to the beginning, we have Salvo and some friends are over for a card game. They're playing Truco. And the friends are inside, and they notice that it starts snowing outside. And they just pretty much are just continuing their game, their conversation. And then they notice that and this won't be too much of a spoiler, they notice that people are on the street dead. People that are outside their homes, and they have died in this snow. And so they are trying to figure out, okay, what has happened? We can't leave the confines of the house or we're going to die. So that's how this story starts. But, Derek, the thing that's so wonderful about it is it builds so slowly, and we get little tiny pieces of a much larger picture. And one of Salvo's constant worries as he and his friends are preparing to find out what's happening here is, how am I going to not only protect myself and my friends, but my wife and daughter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A couple of things that you pointed out about this narrative setup that I really enjoy, and, you pointed out, this is one of my favorite books of last year. First and foremost is the narrative frame of the Eternaut. There's the main story proper, which is this alien invasion that more or less begins with the scene that you described. These four guys playing Truco, and they see it snowing outside, and then things go from there. But the outside frame narrative is this cartoonist, basically a stand-in for Osterheld, is up late at night working on a strip that he's doing, and he's tired, and then all of a sudden he is visited by this time traveler, Juan. So, and then he tells them the story. And then we see the closure of that narrative frame at the very end. And every now and again, not often, but every now and again, we're brought back into the present, so to speak, in terms of the narrative frame, with the cartoonist talking with Juan Salvo about, is this what happened? Tell me more. And so, we're brought to the present just to remind readers that what's going on, what we've been reading, is actually the tale that Juan Salvo is telling the cartoonist. But the narrative, for the most part, is what happens during this alien invasion. And you're right that this is a kind of a long story, really, that Juan Salvo is telling him. I guess it's over one night, right? Late one night. But there's a lot of story packed into that one night.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I love. The other thing that I wanted to mention about the Eternaut is that this was originally a serial. So that's one of the reasons why this is such a long narrative, where you will have characters. One, Favali is another character, a friend of his that he's playing Truco with, who makes it almost to the very end of the story in terms of, how we see him. And we know that we know what goes on with him. But then there are other people who play a part of this narrative as well. It's their various attempts to try something, try it successfully, or even fail at it, and then move forward to the next thing that they need to do to figure out the mystery of everything going around. Like what is this snow that's falling? Is it snowing? Why is it killing everyone? And then once they figure out a way of dealing with the snow situation, dressing as, for instance, this famous image that we alluded to, they decide to dress in suits, wear masks, devise some kind of breathing device. And we should mention that Juan Salvo, Favali, and two of his other friends that they're playing Truco with, Lucas and Polsky, are very intelligent, clever, inventor-like men. And so they can take things and make incredible devices from just a few everyday household items. And so that's how they figure out a way of venturing outside to where the snow won't get to them. But then once they overcome that hurdle, then they have to figure out, for instance, where are we going to find food and drink? And so they have to go out and find supplies. And then once they do that, are there other people? So they go out and try to find other individuals. The army comes to them eventually. Militia is being raised. And so then that's another task that we see them undergoing. So the book is a series of these discoveries, tasks, and mysteries that they have to solve or figure out one after the other. And so it's a long, ongoing narrative. And originally, in serialization, I'm sure that this read like a great drama that people kept having to pick up the paper to turn to. Now, I guess I'm talking a lot about the serialization aspect of this. All to make this point, this doesn't seem, for the most part, like a serialized narrative. You know how with a lot of serials that are collected later on, you can tell that they're serialized because there's a lot of repetition between, let's say, what happens at the end of one strip and the beginning of another. Sometimes you can find this in Eternaut, but for the most part, it's a smooth story.
It really is. It has a seamlessness to it that, as you said, most serialized works, especially newspaper comic strips, don't have. You can read it straight through, and you can really get lost in it and not realize that it was serialized. Like you said, it's just so seamless, and it seems to just grow organically. There's not, like you said, there's not this stopping at the end of a page thinking, okay, well, the people that originally read this had to wait a day or a week to get the next installment. It just seems to flow really well. One of the things that I like about it, not to get too political, but as you mentioned, these guys, Salvo and his friends, are very intelligent and they're very resourceful. These are people that are going to figure out how to survive, and they're going to figure out how to emerge victorious. And I can't help but think that, the original readers of this picked up on it, and, during an oppressive regime, they were encouraged, and this is probably why this has meant such a huge thing to the culture there. Telling the people that, even ordinary people, even though these guys are quite intelligent, they're going to figure out what to do, and they're going to win this thing.
Oh, exactly. Now, was there a point in Eternaut that you felt that the story was flagging?
That's a really good question, because there are these large gaps of time when, as a science fiction fan, you're waiting for the reveal, of the alien or the monster or whatever's going on. And there are a lot of conversations which, between Salvo and his friends, and Salvo and the other people that they meet, because it's not too much of a spoiler to let readers know that they're going to meet other people. So, one of the things that, while there's not a lot of action going on, the characters are constantly asking one another, can I really trust this person that I just met? And can I really trust this person that I've been friends with for years? So there are all these inner kind of secondary plot devices going on, even though, there might be not an awful lot of what we might think of science fiction action going on.
Oh, exactly. And, one example of that, and we see this fairly early on, is with the character Favali. Now, Favali, he's a professor, right? Is he a physicist or a philosopher? I can't remember. It's one of the two.
I wanted to say he was a philosopher. Maybe he was a physicist. I'll have to go back and look.
Maybe he was the philosopher, because there was another learned individual from the sciences. But you're right. I mean, Favali probably was the philosopher. I guess we should know that. But I mention him because early on we see him with Juan Salvo and a couple of others. Right, they're playing Truco, and Favali seems a little petty during the game, and so right there at the outset. There's something about his character that I think for most readers we become a little wary of. And then when they realize that this snowfall is actually, or what appears to be snowfall, is killing individuals, then they go into survivalist mode. You start to wonder, now, is Favali going to be someone who plays well with others, so to speak,
right,
or is he going to be out for himself, kind of like trying to win that Truco game?
Right.
But we learn something very different about Favali as the story develops. In other words, our first impressions really weren't accurate as to the kind of man he is. And so this raises that issue that you mentioned, who can you trust and how are people going to react in extreme situations? And one of the things I can't help but think of when I consider the Eternaut, and I was thinking of this as I was reading it last year, is this is another survivalist narrative very much like The Walking Dead. Now, it doesn't deal with zombies, and it doesn't have that kind of, contemporary sexiness of, zombie narratives. But I think that, The Walking Dead is I think it's more of a survivalist story than it is a zombie horror narrative. I mean, it's that as well. And that's why I think that it bears some similarities to the Eternaut, and it may even owe a lot to what the Eternaut originally did, years before, in terms of showing what happens when you get a group of people trying to make it out and not understanding what has befallen them, when they meet other people, who can they trust, how do they survive, what would you do in a situation like that? These kind of narratives ask the reader to put him and herself into certain situations and speculate, what would I do? How would I react? How would I treat this other person? And so the Eternaut does this in ways that readers of The Walking Dead would definitely recognize.
I think The Walking Dead is a really good comparison because, like you said, there are so many similarities, although obviously we don't have zombies, we have aliens instead. But, the thrust of the book in some ways is not only what are they, the aliens, doing to us, but what are we doing to each other? And like you said, this brings out our true nature. We find out really what we're all about, what our friends are all about when the chips are down and survival is at stake. And basically that's what's happening here. Survival is at stake.
Exactly. And, I like the way you put it, that with this and with The Walking Dead, it's not so much, what the aliens are doing to us or what the zombies are doing to us, but what we as the humans who are trying to survive are doing to each other. Although one of the differences between the Eternaut and The Walking Dead is that with The Walking Dead, we really don't sympathize at all, and we really can't, with the zombies themselves. In other words, we don't get to see who they are as people for obvious reasons. That's not the case, though, with the Eternaut, because we do get to see at least some of the aliens from a more, if we want to call this, a human or humane perspective. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed with the Eternaut is these aliens. And there are several kind of creatures that we see. There are some giant beetle-like insects that I think are the first ones that we see and that Juan Salvo and the others notice. But then there's another race or species of alien that seems to be manipulating those guys, the big beetles. These are called the Menos. And the reason why they're called Menos is because they have these really, really big hands. Yeah. Where their hands are, and I don't know how many fingers they are, but multiple fingers, more than 10 or 15 on each hand. And then there are these larger rhinoceros-like beasts called gerbos, and they are just these gigantic beasts that mow down anything in their way, and it's almost impossible to take them down. Another manifestation, if we want to call this, of these aliens is the robot men. Now, these are actual humans who have been turned into I guess, robots, so to speak, because a device is implanted on the back of their neck that kind of, I guess, tap into their spine and their brain. And so these humans now become nothing more than puppets or robots to the aliens. And then, I guess, the final alien species that we see, and we don't really see them, they're called them, Los Elos. And they remain hidden throughout. Now, there's almost like a hierarchy behind all of these creatures. Ultimately, as Juan Salvo and the others discover, the them manipulate others like the Manos, the people with the hands, and then the Manos manipulate the giant insects or the beetles that we see. These invaders, the them, use other species in order to do their bidding during the invasion of the Earth. Now, all of this is springing from what I mentioned, seeing things from the alien's perspective. This is in the character of the Manos, the people with the hands, because at first they seem a little ruthless, but then Juan Salvo and, what is his name? Is it Franco?
Franco, yeah.
Franco, yes. And this is someone that he meets in the militia. They end up capturing one of these aliens, and they get to know him. And so we get to see this alien, the Manos, as someone who is also being controlled and manipulated, and we see what he is going through. And so it's the humanization of some of, not all, but some of the aliens, I think, that adds much more complexity and denseness to this story.
You're exactly right. And the aliens are, they're very intelligent. They have a legitimate reason for doing what they're doing. And, Derek, as I progressed through the book, I don't know, maybe about a quarter of the way through it, I just kept thinking, I hope this doesn't get ridiculous or stupid. When you're reading science fiction and, you've seen enough movies, you've read enough comics where things do get stupid, and it's just an excuse to have monsters roaming around or something like that. But this is not the point. There is a point to what the aliens are doing, as you alluded to. We get to know what this alien culture is about, and we get some of their backstory. We don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, but we understand it. And again, I don't want to get too political, but the book, maybe the book had some feeling about, maybe we don't really understand the people that we're at war with. Maybe they do have a legitimate beef with us, although we're still fighting to win. We're also trying to understand. So I really like how that's carried on, and I like the way you said that the aliens are. It's kind of a hierarchy, but it's not quite like I was thinking what to compare this to. It's not quite like going through a video game where you go through the first level and the second level and things get harder and harder. In a way, it's like that, but in a way, it's not, because it's very well structured. It's very well planned. You can tell that Osterheld put a lot of thought into this, although apparently, as you mentioned earlier, this story has gone through several incarnations. You can see how much care and development was put into it. It's really we could say that's a thinking person's science fiction comic, but I think it transcends that. I think it goes even beyond that.
Yeah. Well, there's some fans of science fiction that may take offense at what you just said, a thinking man's science fiction. Because, I think most science fiction is extremely intelligent. But you're right.
I do too.
I get your point. This is above the average intelligence of, I think, most science fiction narratives. So, there's something very challenging and complex. We've been talking about this partially as an allegory, right? Mm-hmm. So, that's another way, another level of reading this. And so this is, again, one of the pleasures of reading the Eternaut is there are a variety of ways that we can approach it. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned in terms of approaching the Eternaut is the art. I have to say that Francisco Solano Lopez's art is phenomenal.
It is phenomenal in so many ways, and he does so many things so well. One of the things that strikes me is the scope of the art. I mean, we have a lot of scenes where we see like the landscape of what's going on, all the carnage going on, yet at the same time, his facial expressions that he does are so well drawn. I mean, you can look at so many instances of Salvo, and you can see just from the facial expressions everything that he's going through. And I won't say too much about it, but one of the aliens, he's drawn in such a way that, and this does get into sort of the duality that we were talking about. The upper half of the alien's face looks like anybody we would see anywhere on the street, except maybe the hairstyle is a little weird. And then from the eyes below, it has more of an alien feature, more alien features to it. And it's really, really difficult for an artist to pull that off without it looking ridiculous.
Oh, exactly. And we should mention that this style is a very realistic style of art, very detailed, tons of shading. And, this reminds me of, I guess, what we could call in the United States, the classic era of, newspaper comics like Terry and the Pirates, things of that sort.
Right.
It just, so it's that kind of art. And you mentioned the facial expressions. That much detail does give you a lot of subtlety in the storytelling. So you can see when people are feeling slightly agitated, frightened, even happy. And although, those occasions are few and far between in this story.
They are, yeah.
But yeah, the art is just phenomenal, and the landscape of the story as a whole is sprawling. There's a lot that goes on. I mean, the premise is relatively simple when you think about it. Aliens invade Earth, and then the survivors attempt to fight back in a variety of different ways. That's it. Now, there's a little more to it than that we get at the very end, and in fact within the last several pages. But we won't say anything about that because that's going to be getting into spoiler territory.
Oh, yeah. And, that's one of the great things about this book is, and I don't want to say too much about it either, but, those last few pages, you'll be thinking about those for quite a while.
Yeah. And also the very last page or two has you kind of rethinking, well, what did I just read and what is, how do I interpret what I just read? Did it happen or did it not? Is there something else going on here? I don't want to say it's almost like one of the, who shot JR moments when, Bobby was coming out of the shower and all that. I don't even remember much about that from the 1980s anymore.
I've tried not to remember that.
But there is a different kind of direction that's taken at the tail end of this narrative that has you wondering, but in a good way, right? It doesn't have you thinking about the end of this story in a frustrating way, going, oh my God, I just invested all that time in reading this, and now they pulled the rug out from under me. It's not that way at all. I think it is very intelligently told. And again, I want to get back to something that I referenced earlier, and is, and you pointed out as well, is this larger narrative frame. I mean, this is a nestled story, a story within a story. So, is the inner story, which is what I just described a moment ago, aliens invade Earth and the survivors try to, fight back, is that the main story? Or is the main story the Eternaut, Juan Salvo, telling the creator late one night as he's up trying to get some work done, the story of his life and what that meant? So in some ways, this is a narrative about storytelling and imagination. Which I particularly appreciate.
I do too.
Yeah.
Derek, you certainly, and we should probably mention too that there are some really good essays, a good introduction and good essays in the front and the back of the book explaining some of the things that we've alluded to, like the importance of this title in Argentina and to their culture. You certainly get your money's worth with this book because you get the great story and you also get all the other information. And, like any good book, it leaves you wanting more. And like you said, Derek, at the end of it, you have this feeling of, you kind of, you feel like your time has been well spent because it's such a satisfying story. It's just a great book. I should mention too that, I don't know if you felt this way, but I was thinking all through reading this that this would make a great movie or it would make a great miniseries or a television series. They mention in the book that I suppose it is Osterheld's family estate. Whoever owns the rights to this has stipulated that if this is filmed, it must be filmed in Argentina and it must be in the Spanish language. I thought that was extremely interesting, and maybe that's why we have not seen this. Certainly we could see it from Hollywood. I'm sure they would jump on it, but this is probably why we haven't seen it. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that the brief pieces at the beginning and end of the comic or in the book, if I remember correctly, when you first read this and posted on Goodreads, you recommended in your write-up that if people are reading this, that they read the comic proper first and then go back to read the intro and then afterward.
Right, and that's exactly what I did, because I did not want to have any kind of preconceived notions or influences about what I was about to read. I mean, I knew just from what I had read on the internet or briefly saw that it had some political implications, that could possibly was an allegorical type of story, but I wanted as little bit of that as possible, and hopefully we haven't disclosed too much in our discussion about it. But I would say just read the book, then go back and read the other material. Yeah, I agree. And I did take you up on your recommendation, and so I read the comic before I read the other pieces that bracketed it. Now the first piece that opens it is by Martin Hadis, Hadis, and he lives in Buenos Aires. This is relatively short. I don't think much is given away there in terms of context, but the piece that ends the book is by Juan Caballero. It's called The Eternaut, Superpowers and Underdogs. And this is a longer piece that, as useful as it is, you do want to wait until you read the story proper before reading that, which you probably would anyhow, because Caballero's essay is at the very end. Yeah, definitely the last part you do not want to read until you've finished the book. Mm-hmm. Again, this is one of my best for 2015, and it's something that if our listeners are not aware of, or if they are aware of but they just haven't gotten a copy yet, they should definitely make this a top priority in their reading lives. Definitely. I would heartily second that. And of course, there's much more we could say about the Eternaut, but we need to move on, and let's begin discussing the second title that we're going to be looking at this week, and that is Eric Stevenson and Dave Taylor's Nowhere Men, number 7. Now, Andy, one of the things that stands out about this discussion is that it's a rarity on the Comics Alternative that we talk about a series and an issue other than number 1, because what we've done almost from the very beginning is if we talk about an issue within a series, it's the first 1, sometimes 2, on rare occasions the first 3 issues of a series. It's a rarity, and I'm not remembering an occasion where we've done this at all, where we pick up with a series into a narrative arc or beginning with its second narrative arc, unless maybe there's certain cases where, you can make the justification that a new narrative arc is a new number 1, but this is not the case with Nowhere Men number 7. And in fact, when you and I were discussing whether or not to talk about this for this week's show, we decided to go at this from different angles. Now, Nowhere Men, the first volume, the first narrative arc, was issues 1 through 6, and that was collected, over 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I read it originally. I also recently, in anticipation for issue number 7, went back and reread that first narrative arc. But you didn't do that, right? Right. I purposefully did not reread the first narrative, and because I wanted to see if this issue number 7 would be a good jumping on point for readers who had not read the original trade. Okay, so you're able to judge this much better than I am. Had you forgotten a lot
or even maybe most about the first 6 issues?
Not well. I did forget a lot because there's so much in these first 6 issues. And now, Derek, let me ask you: did you read it in individual issues as it came out, or in the trade, just all at once?
I started reading it with individual issues, like maybe 1, 2, and issue 3, perhaps. And then I didn't pick up the others until all 6 had come out. And then I read those. Now, I don't own the trade, but I own the individual issues. And so even though I didn't keep up with them in as timely a manner originally as I had wanted, I did read them all together before the trade came out.
Okay. The reason I ask is because for people that did read the book as it came out in individual issues, there was actually a 5-month delay between issue number 5 and issue number 6. And that wasn't because there was a problem with the story arc, because 6 is part of that story arc, but there was a pretty large delay. And Derek, I guess we should probably speak to the fact that the reason why, or at least one of the reasons why we've had this 2-year delay, is there was an issue with Nate Bellegarde, I guess is how you say Nate's name. Nate had some struggles. Some personal struggles that we won't go into here, but if you want to, he has posted them online. He was very open about his problems at Multiversity Comics. You can read it there. Only to say that we wish Nate very well, and we hope that he is doing well, and he will be back into the comics world soon. But I think a large part of that 2-year delay was because there was not an artist that could fill in for him. So we've had this enormous delay, and issue 7 has come out now in 2000. I guess it comes out this week, right? Mm-hmm. So we've had over a 2-year gap. And as you said, I wanted to see whether somebody could start reading Nowhere Men right at issue number 7 and still have a satisfying experience.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about your experience, but, as you were mentioning the timeline here, you're right. We should mention that the first issue of Nowhere Men came out in November of 2012. Now, I remember that because Kunka and I did an episode of the Comics Alternative, and this is our first year in existence, where we looked at a number of Image number 1s, and this is one of those titles. Mm-hmm. And it's funny to think of the other titles, the number 1 issues that we discussed at the time, because Nowhere Men's the only one now that's still around. But it was November of 2012, and as you pointed out, there was quite a delay between issues number 5 and 6. So issue number 5 came out in May of 2013, and then 6, October of 2013, and then nothing until this week. Mm-hmm. And so there are quite a number of delays. And the thing that strikes me about this, outside of, Belgrade's issues, is this was a very popular title. And I remember a lot of people talking about it at the time, people getting T-shirts with, images of Nowhere Men on them. And so this was a big hit. And then all of a sudden to have it end after the first narrative arc, I mean, I wondered if we would get another storyline with this. I was hoping so, and kind of assuming so, but who knew?
Yeah, I was too. In fact, in 2013, this was my top book of the year. This was my favorite book of that year, and so I was very, very disappointed, along with lots of other fans, that we weren't getting new stories. And I knew too, and if listeners aren't aware, that the writer of Nowhere Men, Eric Stevenson, is also the publisher of Image Comics.
Right.
And
he's got his hands full.
He's got a lot going on. And I read an interview where Stevenson said, I do this book on my own time. I don't do it on the clock. So I figured that some of that had something to do with why maybe it was coming out sporadically. And maybe that does have something to do with it because, like you said, he's got a lot on his plate. But, this is something that he does off the clock. And, when you get home, probably the last thing you want to do is think about work. But, he's been able to do that. For whatever reason, I'm delighted that it's back and that we're talking about it today.
Yeah. Okay. So since it's been a long time, since you've read that first narrative arc and you came to this, two years later, what is your impression of Nowhere Men number 7? Is it a starting point for many readers, or can it be?
I think it can be. I don't think it is an easy jumping on point. I think everything that happened in those first 6 issues, that story is just too complex to summarize in one issue that appears 2 years after the most recent one. I think it makes a really good attempt in doing so, and we'll talk about some of those things in just a moment. I think it's about as good as an attempt as anybody could do ultimately, but I really think you have to read that first trade in order to fully appreciate the book.
Yeah, I agree. I have to say that before I went back to reread that first trade, or what made up the first trade, I had forgotten a lot about what had gone on in the first 6 issues, or at least the detail. I mean, I still remembered the general outline of the story, but there was a lot that I had forgotten. So I think I would have been very lost in issue number 7 had I not gone back previously and reread issues 1 through 6. So we would strongly recommend that you do so. Either reread issues 1 through 6 or the first trade, or go get it if you're not familiar with it, and then read number 7. And it is well worth the read.
It's definitely well worth the read, and it's one of these Image titles that has a really good introductory price. I mean, the list price is $9.99. I don't know what the DCB service price would be, but it's not going to cost you an awful lot of money to get caught up.
Yeah, exactly. So now here we basically pick up exactly where we left off. We still have reference to the original 4 scientists who in the 1960s were very popular. I think one of them, it was Thomas Walker, or I don't know if it was him, but it was someone who said, science is the new rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And so you have these superstars, kind of like the Beatles, like, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, Emerson Strange, Dade Ellis, Simon Grimshaw, and Thomas Walker. So as we see in the first trade of Nowhere Men, these are the 4 science superstars that kind of rock the world, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. And as we see all the way back from, issue 1, whatever they started with WorldCore, the company that they founded, has fallen apart. Because even all the way back in issue 1, we're brought up to more contemporary times. And as the first narrative arc goes on, we see little glimpses into what had been their earlier association, Emerson, Dade, Simon, and Thomas, and then how things have kind of fallen apart since then. Now, that falling apart comes to a head in issue 6, and so this is where issue 7, the one that comes out this week, really picks up. So Emerson Strange has, suffered something, and so we see him being cared for by his daughter. And so this is, even though she's alluded to in that first narrative arc, this is the first time that we actually see Emerson Strange's daughter, Monica. So she becomes a new player in this next narrative arc. Mm-hmm. And we also see some of the other characters whose actions were a little mysterious in the first narrative arc. So, for instance, we're not sure after the first couple of issues of Nowhere Men what's become of Thomas Walker. There's some allusions as to what may have happened to him that people haven't heard of him. Some think that he's dead. Some think that, he may be still around, but, laying low. But we don't know what happened to Thomas Walker. And Thomas Walker, let me see, was he, what was his science? What was his area of study?
I can't remember because it's been 2 years since I read the trade.
But he's kind of a Dennis Leary type of scientist, in that he has done a lot of drug experimentation and trying to alter his sense and awareness of reality. And many people think that he just got lost into drug addiction and then went off to die somewhere.
I think he's also the first one to leave the group, so to speak.
Right. And then we also learned in that first narrative arc fairly early on that there was a falling out between Simon Grimshaw and then the other two, Emerson and Dade. And, we still have that going on in issue number 7. But there's another character as well, someone who, and I can't remember his first name, but Darrow is his last name. And we see that he plays a role in the first narrative arc, even though it's a bit of a mystery. In other words, we don't know where his allegiances lie. But we do get to see more of him, especially toward the end of issue number 7, which is quite significant. We won't give anything away about the reveal on the very last page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Derek, I like the and again, this is the struggle with reading this book is if you know nothing about what happened before, you're going to really have a struggle with what's going on. Although they do give you enough of, I think they give you enough information to keep you going. And you're right in saying that Nowhere Men is kind of it's kind of a Beatle. It has a lot of similarities to the Beatles. It's almost the original 6 issues are almost a what if the Beatles or someone of their talent and popularity weren't musicians but scientists? Mm-hmm. And in that first trade, these guys are brilliant, and things change really fast, just like things changed really fast when the Beatles were making their music. So many things that we didn't know we could do, or musicians didn't know they could do, started happening, and it started happening really, really fast. Well, it's the same thing with these 4 guys in science. Things started happening at a very advanced rate, but you only pick up little bits and pieces of that if you're coming to issue 7 for the first time. For instance, the way the book starts is kind of off-putting because you've got this picture of a 45 RPM record, and you have this. The title is "Even My Reflection is Asking Me Why." And you can tell it's like a fake ad. It's kind of an ad within the book for that world, that universe. So we don't really know what's going on with that. Again, I'm talking about a brand new reader. And then we get this about a 4-page comic called The Mixed Up Adventures of Monica Strange. And this is really cool because actually this does give you a pretty good idea of what you're getting into. And Monica is basically this girl who's kind of being held up under a microscope because of her famous father, Emerson Strange. And it says in there when she says, we're not carbon copies of our parents. We're our own people with our own interests and our own talents and our own lives. So she's constantly living within his shadow. And we see this in kind of a very cartoony type of comic. And then we see the real man, Emerson Strange, lying in a hospital bed, and he's being tended to by his daughter, Monica, who apparently helped either build or fund or both the hospital that they're in. And Monica is very, very angry with one of the other members of the group, Dr. Dade Ellis. And she says, you woke up from what? Some kind of super coma. And your very first instinct was to grab my father and run off on some kind of adventure. I thought you were supposed to be smart. So we get a little bit of maybe some of the relationships that happen in that first story arc. And it is compelling. If you know nothing about what's happening, I think there's enough there to get you going. And there's a sense here, and in that first story arc, obviously, that these 4 men were enormously gifted, talented, intelligent. They were able to break the rules, or maybe even they thought that the rules didn't really apply to them. And they wanted to change the world in a good way, and they did change the world, but it had some really devastating consequences. You get the feel for that in this issue number 7. So in a way, this is one of the reasons why it would be a good jumping on point, because you get enough of that background, but then things just start happening and characters start becoming introduced that are really going to get confusing, I'm afraid.
Right. Now, some of the characters that we do see quite a bit of, people like Kurt McManus, Adra, Madden, Daniel, Dr. Queen, Jackson Reynolds. Now, these are the characters, and we haven't mentioned this, but in the original story arc, these were the people who were on this, I guess we could call it, secret space station that Emerson Strange... with the rest of them, but primarily Emerson Strange was behind. No one really knew that there was this space station up, circling the Earth, orbiting the Earth. And on this space station, this is in this first narrative arc, the crew members contract some kind of virus. And what this virus does is it changes them in unique ways. So with, let's say, Kurt McManus, it makes him at first into this large blob character, and this large blobbiness turns into, I guess, it being a cocoon for something else that he develops into, which is this large, very strong, I don't know what to call it, monster animal looking type character. And he feels good, after the cocoon stage. But then other members of the crew have other things happen to them. The physician, Dr. Queen, ends up becoming something a little amorphous. I don't know whether to call it goo or fibrous or what, but there's something going on there. And then each crew member has something different that they turn into or it affects them. Sometimes you can see this outwardly with a vengeance, and other times you can't. And now you mentioned that Dade Ellis had been in a coma. What we speculate is that the virus had also affected people on Earth like Dade Ellis, and so his long coma is actually a state where he was not so much in a coma, but he was able to telepathically tap into other things and people around him. So this is a virus that is affecting a few others on Earth as it did the people in the space station. Now, in that first narrative arc, the space station crashed down to Earth. The people safely or most of them safely teleported out. And so now they're being rounded up by Strange, Ellis, and company. And that's where we see things at the beginning of issue number 7.
Yeah. And Ellis is very concerned that the virus might spread, so he wants to, put a stop to it.
And this is indeed what's happening, because there is a writer who's been following WorldCorps who, as again we learn in the first narrative arc, who discovers in, I think it's Tunisia, a part of this space station that no one knows about, and it has a WorldCorps symbol on it. And so he's flying back, I guess, to the UK, and he contracts some kind of illness or disease or something that ends up, I believe it kills him, right?
Yeah.
And so then there becomes, as we see on the news shows, the beginning of a panic that there is this virus that is infecting people, and they want to round up individuals who had been near or associated with this writer.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of moving parts with Nowhere Men, and this was definitely the case with issues 1 through 6, and it certainly doesn't change with issue 7. And in fact, with issue number 7, there are a few additional moving parts that are added to the storyline.
Yeah, there are. And, I almost wish, Derek, that there had been some kind of, disclaimer, not really a disclaimer, but something on there, because, we don't see here new story arc, because it's not really a new story arc. It's really part of the old story arc. But, if it's there, I didn't see it. Something about, I don't know, maybe some kind of disclaimer that this is not the beginning of this story arc would have been nice. And again, I think that it does as good a job as can be done for trying to bring new readers into it without just giving you a whole encyclopedia's worth of backstory. But there are just so many things in there. I mean, the last 4 pages of the story will make absolutely no sense to people who haven't read the first trade. They just won't. But, I hope that people will listen to the podcast and go pick up the first trade, then pick up issue number 7.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we should mention that you and I are reading from an early release PDF that we got from the publisher. And, this may be exactly what the interior will look like in the published issue that comes out in another day or two. But I'm hoping that there's more to the finished issue 7 in that there is maybe a page of recap. I kind of doubt that. I think what we have is what the issue will be. But you're right. This would have benefited, especially since it's been over 2 years since the last issue, with, if nothing else, just a simple 1-page recap of previously in Nowhere Men. And then, we get, as awkward as that may be, Now, had it been, I guess a point of maybe 2 or 3 months between issues, that's one thing. But over 2 years, even those who were really into Nowhere Men, like you and I were, need to be reminded of what was in that first narrative arc. Give us a little catch up. Maybe we don't have that first trade at our easily at our fingertips. And this gets back to what you and I attempted to do in discussing issue number 7, with you not going back to reread the first narrative arc and me doing that, and how our experiences may have been different. Now, I probably was reminded of a lot that you weren't, because you didn't go back to reread that first trade.
Right.
But I still had a lot of questions, and I could tell where a first-time reader coming to this, or someone who hasn't read it since, the original run, will be very confused with issue number 7.
Yeah. I just think that confusion is pretty much unavoidable. And again, I think the creators have done a really good job of trying to make it an easy access point. And for some readers are probably going to jump right in and get the gist of it and are going to be okay. But I think for a large number of people that might pick this up, it's going to be a frustrating experience.
Yeah. I do want to mention before we move on that Taylor's art is really good. There doesn't seem to be any discernible stylistic disruption between what we had been used to with Bellegarde and then now with Taylor, and then Bellegarde, I guess, is going to be coming back. So I think that Taylor did an outstanding job of making the narrative flow as smoothly as possible, along with the storyline.
I would agree. It's almost seamless. And I was just kind of like flipping through the trade of the first 6 issues, and it's a really, really good complement to what's already been established. So, yeah, my hat's off to Dave Taylor for making such a good transition.
Well, we should remind our listeners, as we did at the top of the show, that one of our sponsors, Just Coffee Co-op, is a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates. Remember, 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified coffee. Upon checkout, please use our coupon code COMICS. So go to their website, justcoffee.coop, and at checkout, use our coupon code COMICS for 10% off of your order. And then after you get all caffeinated, you can begin looking at what we're going to discuss as the third title for this week, and this is Amazing Forest #1. This is published by IDW, and this is a different kind of title from IDW in that they don't do many anthologies in comic book serial form. Now, all the stories, there are 4 of them in this first issue. All of them are written by Eric Freitas and Ulysses Farinas. And were you familiar with the work of either Freitas or Farinas?
Derek, I haven't, but I did. One of the I think Farinas' name was familiar because Freitas' name was familiar because I had seen it maybe in Dark Horse Presents. And I think he's done some work for them, and I know both of these writers have done some work as for Judge Dredd, one for Judge Dredd and one for Judge Dredd Mega City 2.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but I was not familiar with them, and like you, I was kind of surprised to see this coming from IDW because, well, IDW does so many different things, and the first things that come to mind for me are things like their properties like G.I. Joe, Transformers, that type of stuff. And then for me, obviously, the Library of American Comics. So I was really glad to see this come out. I didn't really know whether to call it an anthology or a collection since the writers are writing all of the stories, but they have different artists to illustrate.
Yeah, that's a good point. A collection or anthology. I was familiar with the work of Farinas in Judge Dredd Mega City 2. He also did Catalyst Comics, and also he did a one-shot called Gamma. And you're right that Freitas, and I guess it's Freitas and not Freitas, It's Freitas. He did some things in Dark Horse Presents. But I think this is a great writing team, and you're right that each of these 4 stories is illustrated by a different artist. The first story, Tank, is drawn by Julian DeFore, and then the next one, Wolf Mother, by Matt Rhoda, and then the third, Ronnie the Robot, illustrated by Melody Offen. And then the final story in this first issue, Birdwatcher, was drawn by Yumi Sakagawa. And of the 4 artists, Sakagawa was the only one whose work I was familiar with.
Same here. And I know that she's done some work for Retrofit Big Planet and has a few books out. So that was the only name to me that was immediately recognizable in the artists.
Yeah, she did that book that came out the last part of last year, Ikebana, from Retrofit Big Planet. So she knew her work, but the rest I did not. And in fact, I even looked them up and didn't see much that they have done, or at least on Amazon. So I think that it's interesting that Freitas and Farina's, they're working with not only a variety of different artists, but apparently younger artists.
Yeah, it's really nice to see. And actually one of the artists, Melody Offen, does a webcomic called Trinidad, I guess is how you pronounce that. And she actually lives right here in Baltimore, which I didn't know. I'm going to seek out more of her work, as well as the others too.
Yeah. I thought that all of these stories were really good, and both in terms of the writing and the art. And, the art is different among all 4. And I think that each artist nicely complements what this writing team is doing. I would be hard pressed to say which of these stories I liked more, even though I do lean a little bit toward the final one.
I lean a little bit toward the final one too. That's probably my favorite, but I like them all, which is pretty rare for me in a collection or anthology. They're all so different, but they all have one thing in common, is they all involve I guess you would say things being out of their natural element, or either strange things happening within a mostly normal scientific order. So I think they all have that in common, but they are each an individual story.
Exactly. None of these stories are completely realistic. There's some kind of sci-fi-ish or fantastical element to them. So, for instance, in Tank, you're dealing with, kind of like we had with Eternaut, kind of an alien invasion. And the people who invade are, I think they're called slime people?
Yeah.
And they can apparently tap into the thoughts, the desires, and the dreams of the humans that they're invading, and they can appear as friends and family members to them. And then in the story Wolf Mother, there is this war between humans and werewolves. In Ronnie the Robot, we're in a narrative landscape where humans can be, I guess, so to speak, implanted into larger combat robots and become kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two, where the boundary between human and robot becomes extremely thin, or is just not there anymore. And then with Birdwatcher, which has the potential to be the most quote-unquote realistic narrative in this collection, you have a man who is a bird watcher, or as his hat says, a bird nerd, who sees a bird with a human face that seems to resemble his own. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of wacky. And so all of these stories are fantastical in one way or another. But the thing that I really appreciated about Birdwatcher is I think that story, more than the others, becomes almost allegorical in a way. It's definitely a story of people who let certain interests get in the way of relationships that actually should mean something more than a hobby or a particular job or interest. And it's a cautionary tale, and it ends in a bittersweet way. And I think it's a great way of ending this first issue. And I think that's one of the reasons why I liked it so much. It just had a big impact on me.
I liked it a lot too, and it reminded me, minus the, supernatural or odd elements, it reminded me a lot of Adrian Tamaini. And I was thinking that, if you took away the unusual parts of it, that it's something that he would tackle all the time, not only relationships, but, how this relationship deteriorates because of this man's fixation on what seems to be a hobby or maybe a pastime, probably not a profession. But it seems like the type of thing that Tamaini would really take on. But it does have that odd element in it that makes it very, very unusual. And one of the things that I found out too about Sakugawa's artwork is I looked around at some of her other work, and this is really a bit of a different art style from her other works. So, it seems that she maybe is doing a little experimentation with this story, which I find really, really refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if we want to try to find connections between and among the various stories outside of the fact that they were all written by the same team. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that this is any kind of cycle or interlinked collection of stories by any stretch. Although I do see, and tell me if you think I'm off base here, the way that they're arranged, the stories become progressively more somber. So, for instance, in Tank, there's a comedic edge to this, especially at the very end. In fact, you could read what happens at the end as almost like a punchline in a way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then with Wolfmother, we get something at the very end that is sort of unexpected. I mean, not completely, but in a way I was caught off guard almost at what happens at the very end of Wolfmother. And it's dramatic, it's serious, but I wouldn't necessarily call it somber. With Robbie the Robot, the third story, things get a little more dreary, I guess. A little more somber. And then by the time you get to Birdwatcher, oh my God. I mean, that is a very heartfelt and also heartrending ending.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I can see that now that you've brought that up. And again, for me, all of these stories, again, have something to do with, at least to me, about things being out of their natural element or something weird happening within the normal order of life. I think Ronnie the Robot has some elements of comedy and tragedy mixed in. The final part of that story, which is about a young woman named Connie who's working a farm with her daughter Annie, and these two fat, sweaty guys are always offering to help. It's 3 years and your husband ain't been back yet. That type of thing. Mm-hmm. And a robot appears, and we find out the connection between this robot and her husband. And there are some comedic moments, but there are some pretty awful, tragic moments as well. One panel in particular. And yeah, you're right. It probably does not have maybe the same weight as Birdwatcher does, as far as it being a kind of a devastating story. It's devastating in a different way, but I think you're right about the first story being a little bit, and I hate to say the term light. That first story, Tank, about the guys that are trapped within this tank and the aliens are outside. It kind of reminded me of a Ray Bradbury story, not anyone in particular, but just kind of several of his stories. And maybe it reminded me of this too, because I'm reading one of those volumes of the Steve Ditko archives. It kind of reminded me of one of those old Charlton stories that Ditko wrote for them, that, it has this weird science fiction element. And then the ending is just kind of, it just kind of hits you out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. But yeah, these all do have a sense of that. I don't want to call it despair, but I think maybe you're right that they do build on each other, and the weight of them all kind of hits you in the end.
Yeah, and another thing that the final story, The Birdwatcher, does that I think makes it particularly effective is what you could call the distance in narration. Now, what I mean by that, the first two stories are told from a first person's perspective. Okay, so there is someone involved in the story itself who is telling the story. And at times that narrative voice doesn't necessarily become the most dominant within that short piece, but is definitely there. Now, the third one, Ronnie the Robot, is told from, I guess, what you could call an almost omniscient third-person point of view. And in fact, the only narration, the only text you get outside of the dialogue within the panels are just time indicators. For instance, a few weeks later. Things of that sort, right?
Right.
So there is some kind of outside narrative voice, but for all practical purposes, it's almost completely absent, I guess, outside of stepping in a temporal manner. Very different with the Birdwatcher, because there is this very detached third person who's telling us the story that's going on. It begins on the first page of this story. The ivory-billed woodpecker is one of the largest woodpeckers in the world. It was named a Class 6 species a few years ago, meaning it is critically endangered. And that's the first panel. The second panel, the Birdwatcher. He is of average size and has average thoughts. There are many like him. So, from the first two panels, you get a juxtaposition of this. It's almost like a documentary-type commentator telling us first about the ivory-billed woodpecker, and as a birdwatcher would, or a documentarian would, but also it approaches the birdwatcher, the person, in the same manner. So this birdwatcher is like the endangered woodpecker or any other bird that is being observed. And so when I said earlier it is this distance of detachment in the narration, the narrator seems to be observing not so much the birds, but the bird watcher in his relationship with birds and especially with his wife from an almost clinical perspective. And there's something about that dry clinical approach that gives even more weight to what's being told here. And again, kind of underscores the somberness.
Yeah, and I think that adds an element to the sadness at the without giving away too much at the story's end, because it is pretty devastating. Not devastating in a destructive way, but just kind of a this could have been prevented type of sadness. Had things worked out a little bit differently, had the protagonist been a little bit more sensitive to what was going on beyond the binoculars, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. But again, for me, it's that distance. So, for instance, in the very last panel, when you get that voiceover, and I don't think this is giving anything away as to what happens, but the documentarian voice says, when the birdwatcher no longer yearns to understand, he can no longer yearn to live. Now, there is this kind of detachment without the empathy, but what happens within the panels, the story proper that's being told, I mean, we're really drawn to. And so what happens with the birdwatcher, we can feel. But the narrator doesn't, or it doesn't strike me as having much empathic connection to what's going on. And so it's that distinction between the story that's being told and the story that's unfolding within the panels that I think adds to the impact of what happens in Birdwatcher.
Yeah, it's really. I think we both agree it's our favorite story in the collection or anthology or however you want to call it. And the thing about this is I wished once I got to that story and that was over, I wished we had more. And I know a second issue is slated to come out later this month, I believe. Mm-hmm. So that's very good news. I'm amazed at how the writers were able to get such diverse art and art styles. And I did a little research and I saw that the artist for Wolfmother, Matt Rota, he's done some major stuff. I mean, he's an instructor at New York's School of Visual Arts, and he's done work for The New Yorker, McSweeney's, Smithsonian Magazine, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe. I mean, this guy's done some really major league work. I'm not sure if this is his first comic, but if it is, I hope it's not his last one.
Yeah. I wonder how long we're going to have Amazing Forest. I don't know how many issues that it's supposed to be, or if it's just going to be ongoing until it's not going to come out anymore. This is one of the things I love about this first issue and its promise. It's called Amazing Forest, and so we can see metaphorically the forest in the title is the many different kind of growths, let's say. Not so much the story, because we have the same story writing team, but the artists themselves. And so there's a lot of, so to speak, vegetation around to really take in. And the stories are kind of dense like a forest. And I really like this, because each one of these 4 stories, I mean, yeah, we may be leaning toward the Birdwatcher as our favorite, but I like every single one of these. Tank, Wolf Mother, and Ronnie the Robot as well.
Yeah.
There is something amazing about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there really is. And this is and we talk a lot about, anthologies and the demise of them and that type of thing, and to celebrate them too. This is a great way to, obviously experience some new talent that maybe you have not seen before. Maybe you've never read these writers before or seen these artists before, but this is a really, really nice first issue. And if the second one is even close to this one, it's definitely going to be worth picking up.
Exactly. Now, I'm not expecting this to be IDW's Dark Horse Presents, because really, I mean, this is Frida's and Farina's work. It's just a variety of different artists,
right?
And it probably won't be around for the long haul. But while it's here, I think it's a great example of getting a variety of different creators together and just seeing what they can come up with a variety of individual stories.
Now, Derek, speaking of Dark Horse Presents, we know that a lot of those stories that are in Dark Horse Presents either go on to be longer stories or longer series, or had come from that, or are a part of a longer series. I don't really see any of these stories. I mean, I guess they could be expanded, but I don't know. What do you think? It seems like they work as short stories.
Yeah, they're short stories. The only one of these 4 that could conceivably go on, I think, would be the first one, Tank. But even then, I think we get an end point in the story Tank to where I don't expect to see this story again. And I just get the sense that with Amazing Forest, each one of the stories are going to be that and done. Nothing ongoing like you find in most of what's in Dark Horse Presents.
And I'm totally fine with that, because I think all 4 of these stories have a definite, ending that's satisfying, and there's really no need to expand on them.
Exactly. And another thing I love about this is like the comics that you and I grew up with. I really loved reading in the 1970s a lot of the horror comics coming out of DC, like House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Ghost, The Unexpected, and Weird War Tales. And the thing about those is each one of those issues was like what we have now in Amazing Forest #1, right? They're composed of 3 or 4 individual stories, and once you were finished with that short story, that was it. You were not going to revisit that storyline again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great thing. I think we always have a need for that. We like to read longer form stories, and then sometimes we just want something that's shorter, just like a short story collection and a prose collection. So I think it definitely fills a need that we as readers have.
Yeah. The closest thing to this that we've had recently is what we find with Vertigo Quarterly in its various manifestations. The difference between Vertigo Quarterly, though, and Amazing Forest is that everything in Amazing Forest, at least this first issue, written by Fridas and Farinas.
Right.
Well, Andy, we started off with a great discussion of Osterheld and Lopez's The Eternaut from Fantagraphics. After that, we looked at number 7 issue of Nowhere Men by Eric Stevenson and Dave Taylor. And then we wrapped up with a discussion of a new anthology or collection, Amazing Forest #1, written by Eric Fridas and Ulysses Farinas, with art by Julian DeFore, Matt Rhoda, Melody Offen, and Yumi Sakagawa. So a lot of good comics for this week.
Yeah, a lot of really good stuff. And, you must pick up the Eternaut. And we hope you'll pick up the other two as well. But please do pick up the Eternaut.
Yeah, if you were going to prioritize these, and we're a little biased because, Andy and I thought that this was one of the best of 2015, get the Eternaut and then you can get the others. But all of them are worth checking out. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about them on the show.
That's right.
Yeah. And if you want to find great deals on comics, you can go to Discount Comic Book Service. And in fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now and do a search for Eternaut, you'll find that you can get that at 35% off of the cover price. So you only pay $25.99 for this great book. And we didn't even mention in our discussion of the Eternaut the packaging. And Fantagraphics does a phenomenal job of this book. The binding, the cover. It comes in kind of a plastic case, and then around the plastic case is a cardboard case. It's just a wonderful book, nicely put together, and an incredible story. So you can find that for $25.99 at Discount Comic Book Service. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave a message for us through SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to keep up with the latest news, one of the best ways to do that is to follow us on Twitter. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we always post all the things that are new and interesting on the podcast, on the blog. So we hope that you will go there, and we certainly appreciate it when you retweet our tweets.
That's right. You can also email us. We're 2guys at comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And I am Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so find us that way as well. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find, as always, every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. So get in touch with us. Let us know how we're doing, and let us know what you're reading so far in 2016.
That's right. We want to hear from you. And until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you in the funny papers.